Dear students, today we will be discussing the Gothic in Wuthering Heights, and in this discussion we will look at the supernatural and extranatural really elements in the novel. When we think of the Gothic, what do we really understand of the Gothic and how does it express itself in the novel? Now, if you look at just the beginning of the text and the narrator's own comments on what he saw when he spent the night at Heathcliff's place, his place, you find he says, "My fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice cold hand. The intense horror of nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholic voice sobbed, 'Let me in, let me in.' 'Who are you?' I asked." Unquote. The narrator witnesses the ghost of Catherine, and this is the Catherine it is the older Catherine who has been in the moors and is become a ghost now and constitutes the Gothic in the text. Now, the Gothic really, the interest in the Gothic in the 19th century actually came up from the 18th century Horace Walpole's works. Now, there the idea of the Gothic emanates from that which is unnatural, supernatural, that which is inexpressible, incomprehensible, and at the same time one which creates a sense of horror among the readers. Now, why is it that Emily Bronte brought this element into the novel? You see, the novel at its center is about the love of Heathcliff and Catherine, and when Heathcliff loses Catherine, he goes mad and he becomes a monstrous being in human form. But on the other hand, you have the character of Catherine who turns into this icy cold ghost who's roaming around in the moors. There is a suggestion that I would like to take you back to our discussions on nature and culture also, suggesting that Emily Bronte, she lived on the moors, with her family, and there was no neighborhood that they had. They were totally surrounded with darkness, with wildlife, with forests. In such an atmosphere, it was only natural to believe in tales that they had heard about the woods and who inhabited the woods. So she's not a city girl in that sense. She's not living in London. She's living far away in the Yorkshire district, and there, from that point of view, she is looking at the world as it appears to her as a young girl. Now, I would like to also draw your attention to another fact, that as a young girl, there are, the Gothic also found manifestations in the 19th century novel, especially among women novelists, because it was a part of their being that could not be expressed in their conscious life. In fact, Emily Bronte's sister Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, in which she created again the character of of a black woman, or a Carol, a woman who doesn't even resemble human life. So there is Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre's life, who is her alter ego in that sense. And in fact, she is the person who constitutes horror in the novel. So the horror aspect of life, or that which is horrific, that which is unspeakable, that which is incomprehensible, gets registered in the minds of these women novelists, and you will find that hysteria is an extension of that itself. So we look at some of these points when we discuss the text in general. But let's return to the quote that I just gave you right now by the narrator. The narrator, who's spending the night at Heathcliff's place, is shocked by the incidents of the night, where he realizes there is actually a ghost that lives there and that actually wants to come inside the house. So these fingers that closed on his fingers were little icy cold fingers, and the nightmare returns to him when he hears the sobbing of this girl who says, let me in the house. The narrator is totally shocked by the incident, and he in fact shuts the window and doesn't let in. When he asks who it is, this little girl says it is Catherine Linton. She replies shiveringly, and this is again a quote from the text, "I've come home. I'd lost my way on the moor. As it spoke, I discerned obscurely a child's face looking through the window." Terror made me cruel, and finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist into the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it wailed, "Let me in." So there is violence attached to this incident. Of course the narrator is shocked beyond his imagination that the ghost has got hold of his hand and he must free himself from it, and yet he cannot help being cruel in the situation, and he actually rubs the hand to and fro from it, and the whole bedcloth is soaked in blood. So it's also something that we must remember, that 19th century in England was a period of pulp fiction when pulp fiction really became very important. If you also look at some of the critics at the time, including William Wordsworth, who actually wrote about how society is degraded into pulp fiction, about getting into vulgar literature, reading Gothic stuff, about tales about monsters, and so we had left in literature the higher path and high literature, so to speak. So you often find novelists of the 19th century, because the pulp fiction and the Gothic fiction has become important in the 19th century, because these things now are a part of their imagination, you find that a lot of novelists use the Gothic, including our very mainstream writers such as Charles Dickens. Now Charles Dickens again wrote a lot of stories, short stories which were which had horror in them and could border on the Gothic. So the interest in the Gothic in the 19th century is something that is a kind of a widespread phenomena, and writers are constantly using it to good effect. Now I wouldn't say that you should term or define Wuthering Heights as the Gothic novel, but the Gothic is an important element of it. And what is most interesting here is that the Gothic is used to project or express an idea. Now that's where these phenomenal or dominant writers of the 19th century, they stand apart from those who wrote pulp fiction or Gothic literature. These writers who have come to now occupy a pedestal space in literature, such as Emily Bronte and Charlotte Bronte, these people used the Gothic to good effect to be able to talk about society's problems, to be able to discuss the inherent weaknesses and the inherent fears that occupied people's mind. So the narrator at this point in the novel is mad with fear and turns violent, and is ready to crush or cut off the hand of this ghost. So this sense of madness in fact is which is in a kind of a temporary phase in the narrator. If you remember, the narrator is actually the city man who has come to the moors, and he is the most sane figure here. He is the conventional person. He is like the reader in that sense, who views from a distance the scenes that take place in the moorland. Now when in this moment he turns mad with fear, he actually becomes a part of the world and the landscape of this novel. He becomes a part of this landscape because he's become as mad as Heathcliff always is, or as mad as Catherine is. So there is, the idea of madness is foregrounded through these characters, and even the most conventional and normative character, which is the narrator in this novel, also in this moment turns as violent and mad as the antagonist Heathcliff. And this is where we also come to the conclusion that it is the situation that makes the person mad and violent, and not necessarily an inherent trait. Now if I have discussed this earlier with you as well, where I discussed that how characters in the 19th century, because they belong to the realistic tradition, these characters are round characters and not flat characters, and they have the ability to change, and they do change over a period of time. So an important aspect of realism is in fact this attribute that characters will change in the course of time. So the narrator in the novel, who is otherwise a conventional normative figure and who represents sanity and looks and is an objective observer in this novel, he too, in the situation that he's caught in, turns exactly like the antagonist, that is Heathcliff, and takes on his attributes. So there is change in the character of the narrator as well, and even he is not a flat character in the novel, just as other characters around him are, and that is worth remembering. Now, as we move on to the ghost of Catherine, as I just told you that these pedestalized writers or writers such as Emily Bronte, who have been genuine writers of the century, these writers actually use the Gothic to convey an idea which is central to, say, 19th century life. Now, one of those ideas is the idea of homelessness. Now, the ghost of Catherine in the novel says, and I quote, "I've been a waif for 20 years, homeless and deprived, longing for union with the man and the house she loves." Now, when Catherine suggests that I've been a waif for 20 years, she's suggesting that she has been a wanderer all these years. She's suggesting that she's been homeless all these years and is looking for a union with the man, that is Heathcliff, who inhabits, but also the house. You see, the house plays a very important role in this particular novel. I have discussed this at length in the lecture on nature and culture, if you have already seen that. But the idea of home is very central to Catherine, because it's almost, both Catherine and Heathcliff in the novel say that Catherine says, "I am Heathcliff and Heathcliff is me," suggesting that there is a kind of a spiritual oneness between the two. And in fact, the spiritual oneness is asserted at the end of the novel when both Catherine and Heathcliff become ghosts. So, in that sense, the idea of the Gothic is carried forward till the end, because in real life, in societal life, in the kind of societal pressures that they deal with and in the conventions that society has, Catherine and Heathcliff really have no place. They must go outside society. Again, one is reminded of Jane Eyre's life in the novel Jane Eyre by Emily Bronte's sister Charlotte Bronte, where again you find that Jane Eyre must leave society and go into the wild and build her home over there. And it is important for her then that Rochester and Jane Eyre in that life, they lead in the forest. They are not able to return to society. So, there is a sense that Emily Bronte too is trying to project through this novel, Wuthering Heights, that Catherine and Heathcliff cannot become one in society, because society will not accept this kind of a union. You see, Catherine, of course, there is a lot of power dynamics that work in the novel, that Heathcliff was a kind of an orphan who was taken in by Catherine's father, and when he was taken in, then he was a nobody. But then over a course of time, he was able to build a fortune, so much so that he could buy the very house that Catherine inhabited. Right. So, in that sense, you find that the homeless Heathcliff was able to make home with Catherine in the place, and yet society, even Catherine's brother, would not have that to be the case. In fact, Catherine herself, when it comes to choosing her husband, deserts Heathcliff, who was otherwise his sole companion, her sole companion. So, when she deserts Heathcliff and she becomes a part of the Linton family, she chooses money over her love. And yet she realizes that in doing so, she has deserted a part of herself and she has deserted the house that she lived in. So, the ending of the novel, in fact, where Heathcliff and Catherine's ghosts are visible in the woods and they are seen happy together, it reinforces, this ending reinforces the idea of homelessness, because also the home that they belong to would not accept their union because of the class divide that exists in that home or in society. So, in a way, Emily Bronte has used this particular aspect to comment on the larger reality of the time in the 19th century, when it was absolutely impossible for such unions to take place, where society and its conventions and its this kind of yawning gap between the rich and the poor existed. Remember, the rich and the poor gap also existed because of this industrialization that has taken shape or taken place in the 19th century, which has created an entire working class in England and in Europe as well. Now, when this class is created, it brings about a large scale migration. People from the countrysides and other places who live in the city, there are slum dwellers. So, there is a kind of a sharp divide that occurs between the rich and the poor in the 19th century in Europe, and this also, this divide gets reflected further off from the city in the moors, in the life of Catherine and Heathcliff. So this is something that we must also remember, and Thrushcross Grange then becomes symbolic of this sense of home and homelessness, which you find that Emily Bronte has been able to comment on through her use of the Gothic. Another element, so I have discussed homelessness with you, another element that comes to the fore really through this narrative of the Gothic, and how excellently here you find that Emily Bronte uses the narrative of the Gothic, is to comment on the idea of heaven and hell. Now connect the earlier passage that I discussed with you with both the narrator's passage and also what Catherine says about her homelessness and her deprived situation, that is the ghost of Catherine. Now connect this other with another passage from the novel where, speaking to Nellie Dean, Catherine when she is alive, that was the Catherine who was dead, it was the ghost of Catherine talking to narrator, but in this case when we are told the backstory in a flashback by Nellie Dean to the narrator, you find that Catherine discusses the idea of heaven and hell and finds herself more akin to hell than heaven. That is another interesting dimension of this novel. She says, and I quote from the text, "If I were in heaven, Nellie, I should be extremely miserable. I dreamt once that I was there, that heaven did not seem to be my home, and I broke my heart weeping to come back to earth. And the angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on top of the Wuthering heights, where I woke sobbing for joy." Unquote. Now this is another instance of Catherine's idea of home and homelessness. Why is it that she finds that she would be more akin to hell than heaven? Why is it that she feels she'll be miserable in heaven, and she in fact would be crying to get back home, and she would be left off by the angels midway and left on top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke up sobbing for joy? So in a way suggesting that Wuthering Heights is somewhere in between heaven and hell, and Catherine would not be a part of heaven. In fact, it also dismantles the whole Christian logic, and the idea of Christianity is again brought into question. Now remember that 19th century is also the period when Christianity receives a big blow. You see, we cannot forget the fact that this is the age of Darwin and Freud. This is the age when the idea of evolution is already made its way into people's mind, and people are already questioning the whole idea of faith and Christianity. The fact that you have not been created by God and that you have evolved from, say, an amoeba, then and you have struggled to evolve, puts foregrounds the idea of evolution. In fact, we should be able to relate it to Heathcliff himself, who has evolved over a period of time. While he was with Catherine and Catherine's father, you find that he evolved into a sensitive human being. But the moment Catherine deserts her and the father is dead, he turns into a beast, suggesting that there was nurturing involved, that there is learning involved, and when one receives love and acceptance, one can turn into a sensitive soul. And in the lack of this love and nurturing of the soul, one can turn into the beast. So there are both ways available to the human being, suggesting that nobody is born a villain, that the villain is born because of circumstances and because of non-acceptance and one who is devoid of love. So you see, the idea of evolution in itself is brought forth in the novel Wuthering Heights through the character of Heathcliff, who evolves into a sensitive person till he is seen as an outcast, until he is seen as a kind of a beast, and so much so that he then decides to become the beast. So in that sense, you find that the idea of heaven and hell also comes into question when Catherine, the main character in the story, decides that I am more akin to hell than heaven. She's also dismantling the Puritan ideas that are associated with a kind of life which is frugal, which is devoid of passion. What she means by hell is not this kind of crime as some people might suggest, but by passions. She is driven by passions, she is driven by her will and what she desires. So she is a votary of her desiring self and not a votary of conventional mathematical logical explanations that society might offer to her. And when when she falls in the trap, in fact, when she decides that, well, let me be logical for once and marry a man above my station, at that time she realized that she has compromised with her soul and she has betrayed Heathcliff in the process. So, Catherine, this sense of lack of belonging and this homelessness is central to the character of Catherine, because she is a misfit with Linton, and she is not able to go back to Heathcliff even when she desires it, because now she is a married woman. Now, Catherine calls herself an exile within quotes, and an outcast, right, in the house of Linton. And so the motive of madness surfaces, and again the motive of madness gets attached with the idea of the Gothic in the novel. So you can see the Gothic, you see, is basically to do with the monstrous in life. But what is interesting is that in the case of Catherine, it is really a ghost, but in the case of Heathcliff, he is a living human being, but a living sort of a monster. So the idea of monster is extended in scope, right, and it is not just the ghost who is the monster here, but also Heathcliff very much in flesh and blood. In fact, he behaves as a wolf in the novel when he starts digging Catherine's grave the moment Linton tells him that he saw a ghost and she said she was Catherine. He thinks that Catherine has come back to meet him, and he is ready to embrace the ghost of Catherine and live with with the grave if he has to do that. So it is that sense of madness that gets associated in the novel with the characters who are central to the entire narrative. So this is pitched against the sane, in fact, conventional voice of Nellie Dean. So while there are these passionate individuals who adhere with the ideas of hell, there are others such as the narrator and Nellie Dean who are more conventional voices, and would obviously believe in the idea of heaven. The agony of the woman writer really gets expressed through the Gothic, and this is the point that we must remember, and that could be seen as very specific to a woman writer. Now, while there is an entire logic of heaven and hell, and there is an entire discussion around the idea of ghost and of wilderness, of nature and culture, there is this larger attribute that we must remember gets associated with the woman writer, and this woman writer is expressing her sense of repressed hysteria, repressed emotions, which then get translated to hysteria. Now, this is an idea that I want you to focus on. How is it that the agony of a woman writer gets expressed through the Gothic? You see, women in the 19th century were extremely repressed. They of course didn't have any education system. They were educated at home through governesses. They were also educated along ideas of Christianity. Also, if a woman tried to read and write, she was called the blue stocking, which meant she was being unfeminine and that she was being masculine. So in fact, you find that Emily Bronte had to use a pseudonym, a male pseudonym, to write a novel. She could not write as a woman about things because it was not allowed, and then even if it came into the market, it would not be bought, and if you wanted to be taken seriously, then you had to for instance write as a male. So there were these in fact, I would suggest that you read these two essays, very interesting essays, one by Elaine Showalter, which is about the literary tradition of women writers, and the other essay which is totally on the idea of Gothic and the repressed in women by Susan Gubar, and it's titled The Mad Woman in the Attic. Now, The Mad Woman in the Attic is actually a reference to Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte's sister's novel Jane Eyre, and the character there. But in actuality, there is also discussion on Emily Bronte's ideas and her use of the Gothic. Now, 20th century feminist studies have focused a lot on these 19th century women writers and their use of the Gothic in their novels. Interestingly, they find that women were able to express through the ghost, through the monster, through the horror aspects, much more than they did in their conventional speech. In their conventional speech, they spoke like men would have them speak. They spoke like the conventional traditional woman. But when they used the ghost and when they used the monster, then they spoke in their own voice, because this monster could get away with anything. And their women could also discuss, could talk about how repressed they were. Now, what do I mean by repression or repressed? I would also invite you to do some research on Freud's idea of the repressed, because that goes very well with the Gothic, you see. And in fact, Sigmund Freud, the noted psychologist, he has in fact also discussed a lot on hysteria and women's hysteria. And so when you find Catherine's mad speech as a hysterical speech, you find that this is actually a result of psychological violence. That violence is not always of the physical kind. It's not always of the bestial kind. It can be the violence done to the mind of a woman. That psychologically she can be forced to become mad and become hysterical, become absolutely raving mad. This violent and frightful cry of human suffering, emphasizing the constraints imposed by Victorian society on women, is what you should be focusing on. So, what is this violent and frightful cry of a human being? It is of a human suffering of a woman that emphasizes the constraints, the pressures, the impositions that Victorian society put on women. And at the root of this Gothic is this repression of women, who then burst out in these violent, frightful cries and show their real color. I would also like to here quote from a very interesting book titled The Novel and the People. Here the writer is Ralph Fox, and he has noted something about the passages, such passages, these violent passages in Wuthering Heights. He has said, and I quote, "Words of agony wrung from Emily by her own time, and no other age could have tortured her so sharply, twisted the words of aching, awful suffering out of her in accents of such terrifying force. Through the book, with the grotesque and horrid echo of a chorus, runs the complaint of a farmhand Joseph, the canting Joel's, hating and hateful symbol of the obscene morality of his age." Unquote. So, Ralph Fox here is focusing on the obscene morality of the Victorian age that forced women to take this kind of recourse to the grotesque or the horrid or the horror stricken and the terrorizing. It is through words of agony that the writer Emily brought forth the tortured sensibility of women at the time. The twisted words of aching and of painful suffering that they went through because society imposed these rules on them, and they then found a way through the Gothic or through the horror that this novel surfaces. So, what is the view of the world expressed in the novel? The novel actually ruptures the accepted logic of society. It actually breaks free from the confines of a petty bourgeois life, and that is where it actually deviates from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Because Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre towards the end actually fits in the larger paradigm of society, and it opens some uneasy questions, but it never really takes you beyond it. It fits in the larger paradigm of society by making the two characters marry, and marriage becomes the kind of a symbolic act of order and union and harmony. Everything is right with a happy married life, or it's a happy ending, right? But this is not the ending that Emily Bronte chooses for her novel. She in fact chooses to end her novel with the monsters or with the Gothic, with the unnatural world, suggesting that the societal world cannot accept and is unacceptable to both Catherine and Heathcliff. In fact, these are the characters who reject this life. So, unlike Charlotte Bronte, who makes these characters accept marriage and the conventions of society, Emily Bronte actually challenges it and makes her characters reject the societal situation or societal convention and makes them die and become ghosts who will then freely roam the moors and become one with it. What is the nature of feelings the writer generates? Wuthering Heights showcases a spiritual struggle, a grappling with life of almost inconceivable intensity and magnitude. It is a spiritual struggle at the end of the day, characters who are trying to break free. You see, Catherine in Wuthering Heights is a self-willed woman and a rebellious woman. The Gothic is an expression of this repressed woman writer, and so this is her spiritual struggle, and at the center of this novel is this spiritual struggle. So finally, I would like to conclude our discussion today with suggesting that Wuthering Heights is actually beyond time and space, because it uses ghosts who are immortal and primeval and as elemental as nature and as elemental as passions are in the novel. It is a novel that turns into pure poetry, and even if it is a cry of despairing agony of the novelist regarding the life as she saw it, the life of factory and workhouses, it is still a novel which deals with the spiritual struggle of the protagonist. And this is where we end today's discussion. I hope you made sense of it. Thank you.